This is my randomology, and today we're going to find out what makes pink slime so scary. "1988's The Blob" is a remake of the 1958 sci-fi classic, which was a fairly cheesy, pretty low-budget movie about a red gelatinous blob that ate people. Now, the remake keeps the basic premise, but completely ups the budget, the gore, the stakes, the emotional stakes. Pretty much everything about this movie is just bigger. What's most impressive, though, is that the remake actually ends up playing with a lot of horror tropes. It doesn't quite go meta in the way that something like Wes Craven's New Nightmare or even Scream several years later actually went, but it plays with expectations in a way that is very rare to see in a movie of this time. It's honestly criminal that this movie does not get talked about when you talk about great movies from the 80s. It just seems to have gotten lost in the shuffle. I mean, there are horror fans that I've seen watch this movie and be still genuinely surprised by some of the twists and turns that this movie takes. In fact, want to know how unseen this movie is? Back in August, I got to meet Shawnee Smith at the Houston Horror Film Fest, and when I asked her about the movie and I was just gushing about it, she told me that her own kids had barely seen it, and they had the same reaction a lot of people I've seen have. Why don't more people talk about this movie? So let's get to The Blob and find out why I think, this is my opinion, that it's actually a worthy successor to something like The Thing. Yeah, The Thing. There's a lot of comparisons to be made between the two. Both of them severely underperformed at the box office and didn't do great with critics at the time of their release, but in the years since then, they've been rediscovered. Both also benefit from great casts and an incredible set of special effects that brought the monsters to life. Now, I don't think this movie is as good as The Thing. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's definitely up there. Now, I'll tell you the whole thing and why in just a few minutes. Now, let me give you the non-spoiler version of why this movie is so fantastic. If you're familiar with horror movies at all, you can probably tell generally what's going to happen in one of these things. What's great about The Blob, though, is that it manages to actually introduce a series of twists that you don't see coming. They legitimately come as a shock. The writer and director know how to treat horror, so they know the expectations that people have coming in, and so they can play around with them. More importantly, though, all of the main characters, and including a good amount of the secondary characters, get a chance to actually be multi-dimensional people. Like they have various complex interactions with each other, and so when some of them actually start dying, you feel it. I mean, these are kills that some of them come out of nowhere. Some of them, when you see them coming, you really don't want them to happen. And then, of course, there's the special effects, which I'm going to break down a couple of scenes for you later on. Again, spoilers though. But the special effects team pretty much had to bring every single trick in the book at the time in order to bring the blob to life. I mean, think about it this way. How do you animate slime? How do you puppeteer jelly? So that's all I can say without spoiling this thing. So if you are fine with spoilers, keep watching. So let's get to The Blob. So the movie begins with shots of a small town in Arborville, California, which was actually filmed in the town of Abbeville, Louisiana. I think it's pronounced Abbeville? I'm actually not entirely sure. The opening shots actually would not look out of place in a Stephen King story, and soon enough we get to meet our three leads. We got Meg, who's played by Shawnee Smith of later Saw fame. She's your typical cheerleader and popular girl. She's bubbly and sweet and everything Americana you could think to ask. Apparently, James Wan and Lee Wydell were such big fans of this movie, they actually cast Shawnee Smith in Saw based on her performance in this movie. Next, we meet Paul, her would-be boyfriend, a football player and a genuinely nice guy who has a date with her on this fateful day. Or more accurately, he asks her out when he gets knocked on his ass in the middle of the game.
Plans this evening?
Now, Paul has a friend named Scott who comes off more like a stereotypical jock douchebag, which really goes to show that Paul is none of those things. I mean, their friendship is really there to just contrast that Paul is a legitimately good guy. He's set up as this movie's version of Steve McQueen's character from the original 1958 movie, who was, oddly enough, also named Steve. Also, fun fact, apparently Donovan Leitch Jr. and Shawnee Smith went to prom together when they both went to Hollywood High. Now our third lead is Brian, who kicks off every bad boy trope you could find in a 1980s movie. Okay, you ready for this? The hair, the bike, the underage drinking, the smoking. However, early scenes after getting this little introduction actually show that he may not actually fit the full stereotype of the bad boy. After he crashes his bike, he goes back into town to borrow a set of tools from the town mechanic, Moss, and it appears the two of them actually get along pretty well, and Brian doesn't come off like a dick or a jerk or any of that.
Moss, what's happening?
You look like hell.
Hey, it's a fashion statement, man.
The statement them clothes got to make is I look like hell.
And by the way, if Moss sounds familiar, it's because he's played by Bo Billingsley. Yeah, friggin' Jet Black himself. I told you this movie was stacked with talent. After meeting a few more people around town, we finally meet Sheriff Herb.
You know, there's a new band out at the Tin Palace tonight.
Is that right?
Be pretty good.
We cut to later that night as a homeless man simply named Can Man in the credits. No, I'm not kidding, that's his actual name in the credits. He sees what looks like a meteor falling into the forest and decides to investigate. Now, the first time I saw this movie, I thought it was kind of weird that the meteor kind of seemed to swerve as it was coming down, which is weird because a meteor wouldn't do that. But when you get to the end of this movie, you kind of realize why, and it actually serves as a little bit of foreshadowing to one of the movie's big twists. Can Man goes to investigate and finds a weird glowing liquid inside and does what any normal person would do. He pokes it with a stick. This proves to be a horrible idea because the Blob uses the opportunity to climb up the stick and onto Can Man's hand. So Brian's out in the woods trying to fix his bike when Can Man goes running towards him, trying to get this piece of slime off his hand and even trying to use a hatchet to cut his hand off. As Brian tries to chase after Can Man to try to figure out what's going on, Can Man runs in the middle of the road and gets run over by Paul and Meg on their way to their date. Now realizing Can Man is injured, they pack him into the car and make Brian go with them since he was not only present but may actually be able to provide info on what happened to Can Man. Now this exchange is actually very important because during the exchange, Brian and Paul bicker a little bit, but it's clear that Brian is more concerned with getting into trouble for something he didn't do than not really caring what happened to Can Man. Also, we get to see that Paul is not afraid to stand up to somebody like Brian and genuinely wants to do a good thing here. In fact, a couple of scenes later, when Can Man actually gets taken into the hospital and to see the doctors, Brian actually takes a moment to try to comfort the guy and let him know that he's going to be okay. This helps to further establish that Brian may not be everything he seems. Also, it solidly establishes Paul as the hero of the story. He's the one that is proactive and actually taking action in order to make sure that things work out for everybody. Once Can Man actually gets seen by the doctors, however, the gang splits up as Brian leaves since he doesn't want to get into trouble and get blamed for something he didn't do. A few minutes later though, Paul sees Can Man acting strangely in his room, gets the doctor, and both subsequently find that Can Man no longer can. The man has been turned into pork stew in the span of just a couple of minutes. Paul goes to the doctor's office to call the cops, but he gets jumped by the now much larger and much pinker Blob. Now this effect is one of the first times we get to see just how good the effects in the movie are going to be, because think about this for a second. How do you animate slime? How do you animate gack or goo or whatever this is? How do you make it move the way you want it to? Well, apparently the special effects team made a set of silk quilts with slime sewn into cells of different sizes. One of the things that these blankets were filled with was something called methocel, which is apparently a thickener used in milkshakes. Aside from being very slimy, it's also extremely slippery. This was apparently one of the things that they used throughout the movie to give the various versions of the Blob that kind of gooey and slimy look, even if it was a physical puppet. So when the crew needed the Blob to move, all they had to do was puppeteer this blanket and have it move the way they wanted it to. Now, I wasn't kidding earlier when I said the special effects team used practically every trick in the book to make the Blob move and act like they wanted to. They kind of had to. They used puppets, stop motion, they used miniatures, they used trick photography, they used everything, and frankly, it makes for one of the most interesting monsters in cinema. They also have to keep changing their techniques because the Blob actually changes how it looks as the movie goes on. Early on, you saw it was kind of a clear thing. Now it's more pinkish, and as the movie goes on, it becomes thicker and more opaque the more it eats and the more things are stuck in it. The shot of Paul being melted was also accomplished by a miniature work for some of the long shots, which you can kind of tell because as Meg is trying to grab onto him, her emotions don't exactly look natural. Also, if you'll notice, that globe that was there when Paul walked into the room is now huge because I guess they couldn't find a globe that was the right size for the set they were building. So anyway, that's the hero of the story. Paul is dead. Yeah, the guy the movie's been building up as the hero of the story just got melted before our eyes. This is the movie's first big twist. The supposed hero of the story is dead in the first act. Everything about the way people interacted with him to the way that he was set up as a character said, main hero, and now he's gone. The police arrive quickly enough, finding one dead body and Paul's severed arm, and conclude that somebody must be a complete psychopath in order to do this, so Briggs obviously thinks Brian. Now, Briggs is more than happy to nail the town bad boy for apparently killing one of the star football players, but Sheriff Herb has to admit there is nothing to hold him on. He does not have a drop of blood on him, there's no motive, he doesn't even understand how he could have done it, so they have to let Brian go. Meg, meanwhile, goes home and nobody believes her about what she saw. They just assume that she's in shock. Although, to be perfectly fair, if somebody told you that they saw a 5-foot wide blob of pink slime melt somebody, what would you think? Short while later, Paul's friend from earlier, Scott, he's over at Makeout Point, and he is about to get Me Too'd. He's on a date with another classmate called Vicky, and he's getting really close to breaking a couple of laws as he's asking her to drink more and more so he can take advantage of her. When he goes to this bar he keeps in the trunk of his car, I know what I said. I'm not kidding. He has a bar in the trunk of his car. He goes back into the car and finds that Vicky is apparently passed out, and oh boy, things get really awkward and really sleazy. But hey, guess what? Vicky's actually dead, the blob's playing with its food, and Scott gets killed. Very graphically. The last we see of him is trying to kick the window open and then his leg getting pulled in at a very weird angle. Now, Scott is actually one of the only real sleazebag victims in this movie, and it actually was also a really cool effect that they used for his death scene. Now, take a look at this, for example. You can kind of see Scott in the car, and then you see his leg come up and kick it. Now, whoever is actually puppeteering that thing does a really good job of making it move like it's from Scott's body, like it's actually attached to him. But then as soon as the window breaks and the leg gets pulled in, you can tell that it's not attached to anything in any way, and it really sells the idea that Scott has been killed and melted. It's a very subtle effect, and it reminds me a lot of the shot from The Thing where McCready has the petri dish with the blood, and it's a fake hand. You don't know it's a fake hand the first time you see it, so by the time the effect actually pops up, you've been convinced that that's actually his real hand, and it makes the jump scare that much scarier. Back at home, Meg is trying desperately to convince people of what she saw, but nobody will believe her, so against her very good girl image, she decides to sneak out and try to find Brian. Now, Brian's interrogation also set up a couple of other things. It establishes that he's pretty much on his own. Nobody knows who his father is, and his mom just seems to kind of disappear for days or even weeks at a time, leaving him on his own. This comes back later to kind of establish why it is that he wants to be on his own. He doesn't trust people because everybody that should have been taking care of him never really did. It becomes a case of you are what people say you are. It's actually a very interesting thing in sociology that happens when people get shamed into a role or are called some things repeatedly, so they eventually take up that role. So while he's okay with sort of the superficial friendships that he has with people like Moss and Fran, the waitress at the diner later, he does not want anything deeper than that because he's afraid of basically getting hurt. Do you see what I meant when I said that these were multidimensional characters? As Brian leaves the station, Meg rolls up and says that she's there to bail him out. Now, he's legitimately amused, but also kind of touched at the gesture, but says, no thank you, I don't need it, and I don't feel like talking. He also has the delivery of a line that shows that while he and Paul may not have seen eye to eye, he actually feels legitimately bad about what happened to the guy.
Hey, I'm sorry about your boyfriend, I really am. But I'm tired and hungry, and I'm not in the mood for conversation, okay?
By the time he gets to the diner, though, Fran has to tell him that all she can pretty much give him is a sandwich and a drink because everything's closed up. Once again, the movie goes out of its way to establish a character that could just be nobody as somebody who actually has relationships with people. Fran had a scene with the sheriff earlier that kind of established her as being hardworking, being worried about, the town's economy, but also being a little flirty with Herb. Fran, like I said, is also the second character that we see that actually has a soft spot for Brian. So while it would be easy to kind of portray Brian as the town pariah, which it seems like he is, because even Meg's dad, badmouths him as possibly being Paul's killer, Fran and Moss appear to actually see him for what he is, just a kid who maybe needs a little guidance, just a little friendship, just somebody. Meg follows him into the diner and keeps pushing him to talk about what happened. Now, Brian, of course, not wanting to get involved, makes fun of her a little bit, and then Meg snaps at him. She calls him the fake one, the one that's also, I'm sorry, Meg, what was the line?
You act like you're different. You put on this big show. But you're just like everybody else in this town. You're full of shit, Flag.
While this was Meg's breaking point in the conversation, Brian is legitimately impressed with her swearing and kind of getting called out. This is a turning point for both characters, actually. One of the movie's main themes is this idea of appearances. Now, Meg isn't wrong to assume that Brian is simply wearing a mask, but she herself also plays a part too. Appearances and assumptions about what people are and what they're capable of doing play a big part in the way the narrative actually plays out in this movie. Paul was playing the part of the hero, but he died early on. Brian is a town bad boy, and yet he is actually a very gentle guy who does feel bad for other people. Meg is the all-American good girl, but she's not above sneaking out in the middle of the night with an apparent killer out there to try to find out what happened to her, not exactly boyfriend, but guy that she liked. All of this actually leads to the third act, where these ideas of appearances and masks come to a head. As Meg and Brian talk, the cops are still out there trying to find anything that might have done this, and Herb back at the station decides to, hey, you know what, let me go down to the diner. I kind of want to see Fran right now. Meg and Brian bond over a half sandwich, and we get the movie's next kill, which is another impressive special effects piece. George, the diner's cook, has an unfortunate meeting with a sink clog that turns out to be the Blob, and in a gnarly shot, the Blob reaches out through the sink and pulls his head down the drain. The Blob explodes out of the sink and chases Fran, Meg, and Brian. Again, the team had to use all kinds of tricks in order to make the Blob do this. For the shot of the Blob shooting out of the sink, they basically built a miniature set and then just dropped a bunch of slime into the floor, flip the footage, and there you go. Slime shooting up into the ceiling and sticking. Brian and Meg escape into the walk-in freezer, and it looks like they're about to be killed, but the Blob reaches in and then immediately comes back out. This will become important later. Fran, however, is not so lucky. She actually manages to make it outside and get into a phone booth so she can call the cops. As she does, we see the Blob start to envelop the phone booth, and when she finally gets through, she's told that, oh, Herb's not there anymore. Herb actually went down to the diner. Oh, and look, there he is.
Give me Herb. Get Herb Geller.
He went down to the diner.
Half melted and still alive inside the Blob. This movie doesn't pull punches. So the Blob breaks through the phone booth and Fran is dead. And they achieve that shot with, I believe that's actually a dummy that was in there when the slime broke in. Even though we didn't know George that well, Fran and Herb were also established secondary characters. They had a couple of scenes and interactions with each other. Even though the sheriff seemed to have a thing for Brian early on and kind of thought that, again, like he's the town bad boy, he didn't appear to have any actual malice towards him, and even warned Brian that since he was about to turn 18 pretty soon, any trouble he got into would lead to actual jail time. So we have these two characters who, again, seemed genuinely nice, they were good people, and they died horribly. Now, Chuck Russell, who wrote and directed the film, has not been shy about the influence that Alfred Hitchcock had in his own style. And he's been very upfront about the fact that Paul's death basically kicked off this psycho switch, or I guess the psycho misdirection. Now, I'm calling it that based on the fact that the first time we really saw this was in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Marion Crane is set up as the film's protagonist, and when she gets to the Bates Motel and is subsequently killed by Mother in the infamous shower scene, it threw audiences for a loop. Now, what made that scene so horrific wasn't necessarily the way the scene was shot itself, which is brilliant, for a time. It's not gory the way that we think of it now, but it definitely shocked audiences. What shocked them more, though, was that they just spent half the movie following this character as the main character of the movie, and she just got killed off. So this movie, The Blob, is also telling you, in no uncertain terms, nobody is safe. From this point forward, the tension does not let down. And that to me is an amazing feat of writing and, cinema. I mean, obviously there's a couple of points where, characters stop to catch their breath, and we do so as well, but that tension never really goes back down to nothing. After a few minutes, Brian and Meg finally leave the diner when they're pretty sure that the Blob's no longer there. They make it to the sheriff's office and they find out that, the dispatch can't get a hold of anybody because the radios don't seem to be working either. So Meg and Brian decide to just go out into the woods and actually try to find Briggs, because as much as Brian may not like him, he's all they got right now. However, in a kind of a cool little fake out, it seems like there's going to be a UFO that's coming towards them. Turns out to be a helicopter. Now, this is a nod to the original movie where the Blob was an alien organism, and now they're playing with that expectation again for, cool little gag. The two find a government team led by Dr. Meadows, who explains the whole situation to them. They're there to track down a microbe that was on board that meteorite. Now, if something about this seems a little fishy, hold on to that thought. Turns out that Meadows is already working with Briggs, who's been briefed on the situation, and he's about to go into town to get everybody together in order to be quarantined so that this thing doesn't spread. We then cut back into town and find out that Meg's little brother, Kevin, has snuck into a movie with his friend Eddie. Now, we actually saw these two in an earlier scene where Kevin was established as kind of the good friend and Eddie as the not so good friend, the bad influence. And yeah, they tricked their parents into thinking they were going to stay at each other's houses. They just went to go sneak off and to see a horror movie. In the projection booth, Hobbs, the projectionist, feels the AC vents have plugged in and goes to investigate. And bad call, Hobbs. His boss goes to find him and instead sees Hobbs' stew stuck to the ceiling. Meanwhile, Meg and Brian are put in a van so they can be taken back into town and quarantined with the rest of the populace. Brian, though, decides to pick the lock, jump out, find his bike, and leave town. Meg angrily accuses him of only thinking about himself, and Brian delivers a legitimately heartbreaking line.
Then go. Take care of yourself. It's the only thing you're really good at, isn't it?
No one else ever volunteered for the job.
This moment establishes a little bit more about both of these characters. Brian does a little detective work and realizes that it's very weird that a government team swooped down when a meteor crashed, because don't meteors crash like all the time? Like, isn't this a thing that happens, you know, repeatedly? Like, do they send government teams out to every single one of these things? It also establishes that Meg very much cares for her family, so even with that, she needs to go back and make sure that they're okay. When she gets there, however, and reunites with her parents, she realizes that her brother is not there, and after talking to the other kid's mom, they realize, oh, they must have gone to the movie theater. Meg's dad causes a bit of a distraction, and then Meg uses that in order to sneak out of the quarantine and try to go to the movie theater. Now, what follows is a direct homage to one of the most famous scenes in the original 1958 movie. And I'm talking about the iconic shot of people fleeing the movie theater as the Blob is attacking. So finally, having had his fill of movie theater employees, the Blob decides to just start picking people out of their seats. This becomes an epic scene as the Blob uses tendrils to grab people as they're trying to flee. Now, the filmmakers had the projector fail and flicker like a strobe light for an extra eerie effect, which was actually really smart. The flickering actually helps to hide some of the scaling effects that they used to create a 20-ton blob in the middle of the movie theater. It also helps hide the fact that some of the puppets that are being used for people are kind of stop motion. Now, Meg thankfully finds Kevin and Eddie, takes them through a side exit into an alley, and in a surprisingly tense scene, Kevin's sweater gets stuck on a closed door as the Blob tries to break it down. But the kids manage to make it down into a manhole. Cut back to Brian, and he has his bike again. It's fixed, and he's trying to sneak past all the government troops that are in the forest. He hears how they've cut off not only the phone lines, but they've blockaded all the roads in and out of town. And when he passes the main command center, he sees the movie's next big twist. That meteor ain't no meteor. It's actually a satellite where the military was testing the effects of microgravity and space on bacteria. Now, the dialogue in the movie goes back and forth between calling the Blob originally a virus or a bacteria, but I'm gonna just call it bacteria. Apparently the Blob turning into what it is now threw the satellite out of orbit and it fell back down to Earth. Meadows is more concerned with getting the Blob, containing it, and using it as a weapon against the Russians, because remember, 1988, we're still in the middle of the Cold War. And when confronted with the fact that they may lose a lot of civilians, maybe even the whole town, Meadows don't give a fuck. When the government goons realize that the Blob actually may be in the sewers, they start closing things off, but are told that there actually may be some civilians down there, and Meadows just says, fuck it. And thus, Brian takes up the mantle of the hero and decides that he's gotta go save them. Now, this twist actually works wonderfully with this movie because, like I said, the whole point of all these characters and one of the basic themes of the movie is the idea of appearances. In the original movie, the Blob was an alien. In this one, we're told that, oh yeah, it is an alien pathogen, but again, appearances, you know, the people who are here supposedly to help are definitely not here to help. The, you know, friendly doctor trying to explain everything calmly, he's a psychopath. By the way, the character that Meadows says that, you know, it doesn't matter if people die, you know, the guy he has a brief conversation with, is a character called Jennings, who has a couple of lines throughout the movie. And if his voice sounds a little bit familiar, it's probably because that's Robert Axelrod, who I and many others fondly remember as the voice of Lord Zed. I'm telling you, man, this cast is just mwah. After a series of pretty cool stunts in a chase against the government goons, Brian makes it into one of the open sewer pipes and runs his bike into it to try to find whoever might be down there. The government agents, though, have their own teams down there trying to find the Blob as well. In the sewers, Meg, Kevin, and Eddie are walking through waist-deep water to try to reach a grate to get back top. However, they soon realize the Blob isn't there with them, and in another horrific subversion of expectations, Eddie, who can't be older than 12, gets grabbed and pulled underwater. Yeah, they killed a kid right there. Rest in peace, Eddie. I mean, we're never gonna see you again, but holy shit, that's a half-melted kid! Fuck, even it didn't pull this off. We saw like a bitten off arm, but that was it. That shot of Eddie rising up with melted Jason Voorhees and Friday 8 energy is such a jump scare because A, who kills a kid on screen? And then B, who shows you their half-melted remains? Oh, I'm sorry, half-melted screaming remains. Did I mention anybody could die in this movie? Meg and Kevin climb up and try to escape the now titanic blob, but Meg realizes she's too big to fit through the grate Kevin uses to escape, so she sends him off as a trio of government agents arrive to provide a much-needed distraction. So Meg takes the opportunity to try and run and runs into Brian, who gets her on his bike and gets them the fuck out of Dodge as quickly as possible. However, Brian gets turned around the sewers and can't find a proper way out, so he has to double back and he performs a sweet little stunt on that bike. Well, maybe not so sweet since he actually crashes the bike and now they're on foot. So with the bike trash, they go on foot and run into the last surviving government agent, who's actually played by Bill Moseley. He's looking a lot less Firefly with that short hair and no beard. The unnamed soldier leads him to a manhole entrance, but Meadows blocks it with a truck to contain the blob and them. This guy's a dick. So faced with certain death from the blob, Meg finds out that the soldier they're with has an M72 Law, a freaking anti-tank missile. The soldier tells him this thing's not going to do much against the blob, but Brian's not going to use it against the blob.
All right, Meadows, you won't listen to me. Listen to this.
This is where we reach the climax of the townspeople all gathered at City Hall, the soldiers there, our two protagonists, also Briggs, all of them assembling in this one spot to have a climactic showdown. Brian grabs a rifle, points it at Meadows, and then Meadows has his soldiers point their rifles at Brian. Briggs, however, may be a hothead, but he's not stupid. He points his gun at the government agents, and now we have a Mexican standoff. Brian proceeds to explain the holes in Meadows' theory, namely, how do government agents know that there's bacteria in these things? How often does this actually happen? And Briggs, again, not an idiot, realizes that Brian is speaking truth. It also doesn't help that Meadows is really trigger happy trying to shoot Brian. Blob though intervenes before Meadows can kill Brian, although he gets a shot off and kind of grazes Briggs. So now the townspeople realize what's going on, Briggs realizes he's being had, and what do we do now? Colonel Hargis orders his troops to drop a satchel charge into the sewer to kill the blob, but all it does is, sorry, Brian, what did they just do?
I think you pissed it off.
Thanks, Brian. Now very large and pissed off, the blob breaks through the street like a graboid and crushes the colonel. What follows is an amazing climax to this movie as the blob goes through the street, grabbing soldiers and townspeople alike, everybody fleeing, trying to make it to town hall in order to barricade themselves. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this movie was actually filmed in Abbeville, Louisiana. City Hall is actually played by the Abbeville Courthouse on North Street, which ironically enough is next to the town's actual City Hall. You can actually find some of these buildings are still very much unchanged. For example, this red one here, which was playing the police station earlier in the movie, is just down the street from the town hall. You can see it behind the soldiers after the van blows up. It's actually across the street from a place called Magdalen Square, which is where Brian's going to drive a truck later on in a few minutes. The cafe where Fran works actually was a facade that they had to build because there was no building there that actually matched what they wanted to do. Now that facade was torn down after production, and I believe there's a parking lot there now. Again, this is actually right down the street. This is all in the same street from City Hall. There were also some interesting geographic things that I saw as I was looking around on Google Earth at this one street, because most of the movie was shot in this one street and a little bit in a couple of the adjacent streets. Now, when Kevin gets out of the sewer after he's escaping the blob, there's a shot of him going out through a grate, and then a shot from a different angle of him standing up and then running towards the people convening in town hall. But the funny thing is that there is no drainage system on this street. If you actually look across the street, there are no drains like this. There's manholes, but no drains. So they have to shoot that original scene somewhere else and then cut in the scene of the kid actor actually running off. Now, interestingly, the movie theater was played by a real movie theater called Frank's Theater, which was apparently a local institution until it shut down several years after the movie premiered. Now, the building is still there, and there's apparently a petition to actually have it preserved as a historical landmark or a local landmark or something to that effect. Now, interestingly enough, the theater actually is around the corner from this street. In fact, when the soldiers are there and looking at the van, you can actually see the lights of the movie theater behind them. So the geography of the real town actually kind of matches up with what's going on in the movie, which is, I think, kind of cool because, you know, sometimes movies will just take liberties with the geography to make it suit the movie. In this case, it actually worked. Now, one shot that wasn't shot in Abbeville was the exterior of the hospital where Paul dies. This was actually filmed at the Lavina Hospital in Altamira, California, and sharp-eyed viewers might actually recognize it as the exterior of Smith's Grove Sanitarium in Halloween. Yeah, where Michael escaped. Now, that building sadly no longer exists. When the blob moves in for the survivors, Meg is using a fire extinguisher to try to keep it at bay, and that's when she realizes her earlier survival at the diner was due to the blob actively avoiding the cold. More importantly, Brian also makes a similar connection on his own and goes to get a snowmaker truck Moss had been working on in the beginning of the movie. Meg and the survivors barricade themselves in Town Hall, and we get some pretty cool miniature shots of the blob on the outside trying to break in. Apparently, production actually built a 1/3 scale version of downtown for some of these shots. Everybody is fighting this thing and trying to find more fire extinguishers to keep it at bay. Briggs is holding onto a bookcase trying to keep the doors from breaking when the blob grabs him, folds him in half, and pulls him through a hole in the wall. Damn, I was just starting to like him. Brian arrives with the snowmaker truck and uses the truck like a freaking tank to attack the blob and get it away from the rest of the townspeople. The blob refocuses on Brian and flips the truck over with Brian still inside, but Meg finds her inner Ellen Ripley, grabs an M16, one of the satchel charges, and there's the blob to come after her as she rigs one of the truck's broken off liquid nitrogen tanks to explode. It works, and the blob focuses on her, giving Brian time to escape. Meg gets caught on a hose, but Brian escapes, gets her out of the way before the satchel charge explodes, flash freezing the blob. We then fade away as Moss muses that they're going to have to get the blob's remain on ice before sunrise or it'll thaw. Now, this is where the movie should end. If we faded out into the credits, we'd have a perfectly satisfactory ending. But I've been singing nothing but praises of this movie, and I gotta admit, there's one thing that I think this movie does not need, and it's something that I've been leaving out of the summary for this film. See, one of the characters we met early in the movie is Reverend Meeker. Now, after the diner scene after Fran gets killed, he goes to investigate and finds a small shard of the blob frozen when Meg and Brian were hiding. Now, he places it in a jar and keeps it throughout the movie, for some reason. Later, when the blob is rampaging down Main Street, Meeker loses his mind and starts preaching about how the blob is wormwood, the biblical catastrophe in the book of Revelation. He gets Harvey dented when one of the soldiers' flamethrowers explodes, which is why Meg had a fire extinguisher with her at the time. And the last we see of him, he's ranting like a lunatic as everyone else tries to survive. After the blob is frozen, we cut to a now scarred Meeker giving a fire and brimstone sermon about how the day of judgment is coming. And then we end on him holding the now defrosted piece of blob and saying how, oh, the Lord will give him a sign. It's an interesting sequel hook that never really went anywhere, and the Reverend scenes just kind of seem out of place in the movie. Like, it feels like he's being tacked on. You could remove that entire little I even hesitate to call it a subplot, and the movie would just kind of be better for it. And that's it. The Blob premiered in 1988 to, well, it bombed. Let's be honest here. It did not do great at all. But in the years since, critics have been a lot more kind to it. I have seen it in a couple of lists on great 80s movies, and I've seen maybe a handful of reactors actually watch this movie and discover just how amazing it is. It plays with your expectations so much. It is a genuine joy to watch this. This is one of those movies that I could watch over and over again. You know, Halloween, The Thing, this movie. As far as horror goes, I never get tired of this one. So tell your friends, tell your family, The Blob, you should watch it. Heck, might even be a Christmas movie. It snows at the end. I don't know. So, thank you very much for watching. I will see you later.